Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Tyler Finley. My pronouns are they, them, and I am a student in the Counseling for Mental Health and Wellness program here at NYU. And I'll be sharing with you today a presentation on queer ecotherapy. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land I am on as a settler on the land of the Munsee, Lenape, and Mohican peoples near the Mohicantuck, the so-called Hudson River in Jersey City, New Jersey. Um, so the information and reflections that I'll be sharing in this presentation are informed by my experience in a 6-week course, the Ecotherapy Level 1 certificate program at the Earth Body Institute, specifically with a queer cohort. So this meant that both the instructor and my peers were either queer or queer allied. And this program is intended for both counselors and counselors in training, but also activists, healers, and others such as teachers, community organizers, nature guides, and more. So a really diverse selection of people who came to this program to gain some knowledge and skills. And I'm just sharing this to explain that ecotherapy practices really cross a wide range of disciplines and are not restricted to just, talk therapy as we know it. And I also want to share at this point of the presentation that overall this presentation is going to reflect a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary field. And so I want you to bear with me and maybe see that all these parts that I'm sharing connect into some whole, and that maybe you can view them as different ways of getting into different entry points for exploring the subject if you have a further interest. So with that said, let's get into it. Um, so what is ecotherapy? Um, and as we go through this slide, I want to begin by asking you to think about this question. Do you consider the natural world to be a healing space for you or for others? And I think that that's important to inform what your takeaways from this presentation might be, or to consider what your interest might be in this field. And so, first of all, defining nature, I think, is an important thing. So many times nature is sort of used as this term to mean out there, associated with the wilderness. It could be in among the trees, right, at the beach, or places that are uninhabited by humans. However, an important part, a premise underlying ecotherapy is that really the natural world is everywhere. We're a part of it as humans. The trees in our cities, our pets, the rain that's tapping on my window right now, the sky, the ground. So while often I've learned that this work in this domain can be sometimes connected to places that are more isolated or like particularly peaceful. That isn't a requirement. And so currently I'm sort of navigating, what does ecotherapy practice look like in an urban environment like Jersey City, where I live? Um, and so another important part of ecotherapy is considering the natural world as a healer. So if we're to think about ecotherapeutic experiences, there would be this triad. So we have our facilitator, who might be us or me, hopefully in the future, working with clients as the second piece of that. And that could be an individual client, a group, a collective. But then also the most important third component would be the natural world, which would be considered as the source of healing. Um, and so ecotherapy is a practice that is rooted in the theoretical model of ecopsychology, which is a term originating from the work of academic and writer Theodore Roszak. And this refers to a theoretical model that is rooted in systems theory. And it rests on the Gaia theory, which proposes that the Earth is a living organic entity or system of all these interrelated parts. And therefore, a healthy planet is essential to healthy beings, healthy humans, and that the health of the planet impacts the psychological well-being of humans, who are just one small component of a whole system. And as I was encountering these sort of ideas, I sort of viewed it as an extension of that relational turn in psychology and counseling work away from the intrapsychic to the interpersonal. But here we're thinking beyond that relationship of just human to human to the relationship with the environment, with all beings, with the earth itself. And what I like about this is that, like many postmodern approaches, this allows us to conceptualize beyond just a person to diagnose and find illness and dysfunction within. So we could see that if our planet is hurting, if the beings all around us are suffering, so are we. Um, and I think a more familiar entry point into that would be these very direct terms that you may have heard of, like eco grief or eco anxiety, as people are wrestling with the idea of climate change and its devastating effects on the planet. But we can also think of this on an even broader scale, to think about things like mass consumption or depletion of natural resources, um, uh, building on top of land and creating more housing developments and taking away places that maybe people had a history with or a connection to. And so thinking about how all these processes um, create disconnection from the planet and also from ourselves, which can increase feelings like depression or alienation or anxiety. So, the concept of reciprocity is crucial to this framework and this practice. The goal as practitioners of ecotherapy is to, yes, heal ourselves and others in relationship with the earth, but also to heal the earth as well in a mutual fashion. So, really moving away from more extractive perspectives, that stem from colonizing, neoliberal, capitalist mindsets, to more reciprocity, more mutuality. Um, and so a really key part of this is recognizing the way that indigenous peoples have been effective and caring stewards for the land for millennia, for so long, and continue to do so to this day. So ecotherapy really and ecopsychology really borrows so much of the wisdom of indigenous spiritualities and earth connections. And so a crucial part of this work is collaborating with people who already understand the innate connection humanity has with the land and the way to also protect and conserve the land, to not take more than is needed. Um, and so, in that vein, essentially the work of Indigenous liberation is also the work of ecotherapy, because that goal means the betterment of the planet and therefore the health of all beings on the planet. And so some of the ways that we can do this work are in supporting the work of Indigenous projects. So one example that I learned about in the class is the work that Pinar Sinopoulos Lloyd is doing with their organization Queer Nature. And they offer things like stealthcraft workshops, wildlife tracking training, and anti-oppression groups, created particularly for queer folks. Um, the Land Back movement is another great project, and they are seeking to reclaim stolen lands for Indigenous peoples. So returning land to Indigenous folks, rematriation, repatriation. Um, and then finally, we can work to also decolonize our thinking, our mindsets, thinking about how we extend colonizing work in the psychology field, um, but also beyond that sort of decolonization of the mind, really thinking about literal ways to decolonize, such as supporting causes like land back. Um, so with all of that sort of theory and base built up, what can ecotherapy look like in practice? And so a basic example that many of you may be familiar with is a walk and talk individual therapy session. And so this would harness movement and the outdoors, moving through space, maybe sensory exercises as well, right? Or just processing alongside somebody outdoors, and forming a greater connection with the land around you, or for the client to form that connection with the land around them, with you as a facilitator. Next, another thing I think we're probably all familiar with are visualization exercises. And here we would really focus on connection to the natural world, to natural beings. And what I am really coming to enjoy about these types of exercises is uh, the program that I was in with the Earth Body Institute was virtual, and it was incredible being on the other end of some of these visualizations and meditations, to really see the type of connection with the earth and with ourselves and any natural beings or places that we really feel connected with already through memory, um, that that connection is really augmented, and it's amazing that that can be done through telehealth. So I think that this is a really great option for, um, not as an authority on the subject at this point, but something that would seem like a really safe bet to try out, for yourself, or with a client that you're already experienced, guiding through maybe a meditation or visualization or sensory exercise, to think about how you could incorporate these more nature-based components as well, to create a greater sense of safety or support. I think that that was one of the main takeaways for me, was thinking about how we can find sort of nature allies, right? And I think especially of my dog Lily, who's fast asleep right now, as an ally that I love incorporating into my own visualizations. Um, Another example of what ecotherapy can look like, is the use of ritual. And this could be done um, outside or within the realm of traditional talk therapy. Um, but marking important events in clients' lives through ritual can be moving, can be powerful. Um, and we don't have to think of, I think when we hear ritual, we think of something quite intense or just large scale. And that doesn't have to be the case. We could think of even just using basic elements like water or fire, um, or even, objects from the natural world for clients to symbolize their experience of a transition or even of a grieving period. They might, what does that look like for them? How can we symbolize that and have them have that moment, to really sit with it? Um, our next example is art and poetry. And this is wide ranging, but this could look like reading nature poems, or sending resources of nature writing and poetry or art to clients, um, sharing it with them, um, or having clients write, or groups or whatever is being facilitated, a community of people, to write poetry, to express their connection or disconnection, eco anxiety, eco grief. And one of the activities that I led during my experience in the course was a group queer poem, that we all worked on together in a Google Doc. So we took 10 to 15 minutes, and I gave a brief prompt and started it off with just 2 lines. And it was really incredible to see um, just how quickly everybody sort of went at it and got involved and wrote in their own way. And of course, safety had already been established for the cohort and the group, but that was a really liberating experience, I think, because we specifically had a theme of queerness and that queer connection to the natural world. Um, and so overall, all of these are practices um, that clients or consumers or whoever is on the other end of whatever work we're doing or whatever type of eco therapy practitioner we are, um, that these are things that people can take away for themselves as they develop and rekindle their own relationship with the natural world in whatever way is right for them. Um, and I'd also like to just mention some other forms of this that might ring some bells. So you may have heard of equine therapy, horticultural therapy, adventure therapy. So all of these sort of fall within that heading of ecotherapy. And so finally getting to the queer part, I know that this title is Queer Ecotherapy. We're getting there. So where does queerness come in? Um, and so first I'd like to define queer here as yes, meaning queerness that we associate in terms of LGBTQ plus identities, um, but also queer as in different, queer as in liberating, queer as in upending norms, enacting alternative ways of being in the world. Um, and so, in many ways, the natural world is queer. And it was great to learn about how many species there are with natural queer inclinations or processes. So we have species like the clownfish and chickens that have natural processes of being trans or taking on an alternate, gender role. Um, and then there's also the example of many sheep who have preferences for same-sex relationships. And then beyond that, we have our symbols out in nature, like violets that represent lesbian love. Um, and so, apart from those representations and manifestations of queerness in the natural world, we can even think of that queerness as resistance or liberation. In the example of a tree resisting its demise and busting through the sidewalk, right? That's queer, that is, anti-development, anti-capitalism, etc. Um, and so, for all of these reasons, the natural world can be a very helpful space and connection for queer people in resisting the discourse that is so insidious of being labeled as unnatural or intrinsically wrong. Um, and then beyond that, part of this project of queerness in the natural world is also reclaiming spaces as supportive and safe for queer people, considering that, for instance, isolated hiking trails and parks historically have been and still can be dangerous for queer people, particularly trans women of color. And we can also extend that to other marginalized communities, such as people of color, that haven't felt welcome in these like outdoorsy nature spaces. Um, so it's important to both identify with these natural spaces, with natural beings, but also to become welcome in them, to become safe in them, to find our power in them. Um, and then finally, I'd like to share that there is a long lineage of queer people in many cultures who were healers, who had a spiritual connection to the earth and the land. And we can even think of how many people in our own lives who are queer who have become healers in one way or another, especially throughout history, trans and non-binary or third gender or other gender people. And personally, I find this to be a really meaningful entry point into joining into that history and considering the power of this type of work and that legacy. And so, with all that in mind, I would like to leave you with a question to consider, to ponder, as maybe you move around in the outside world or even inside, indoors where you are. What queer processes and beings exist around you in the natural world? What do you see happening that you would define as queer in this way? And so as we wrap up, I'd like to leave you with a few resources to check out, organizations that are doing some great work. So as I mentioned before, Queer Nature. There's also Outdoor Afro, which is working to um, form collectives and groups of Black folks to get out into the outdoors and feel safe and feel empowered and to reconnect. There's also the Venture Out Project, which creates events for queer folks and sometimes queer folks and their families to get out, explore the natural world, go camping, go hiking, etc. And then some of my favorite resources or writers from the course I'd like to share here if you'd like to learn more about the underpinnings of ecotherapy, all of these connected things that I shared about and this type of work. So first, I'd like to point out Joanna Macy. She's a writer, scholar, teacher, activist, Buddhist leader. And I would recommend checking out her material on the work that reconnects, which is about collective ways of reconnecting with the land and of exploring our grief and loss as so much changes for our planet. I would also recommend Dr. Kutcher Risling Baldy. She's a professor of Native American Studies with some great lectures on decolonization, land back movement, how allies can support Indigenous people. And then finally, Linda Bazell and Craig Chalquist, they wrote the book on ecotherapy that was the main resource for our class. So I'd like to just share their names as academics in the field that might be more explicitly writing about the topic of ecotherapy in the field. Um, so that wraps up my presentation. I thank you for listening and bearing with me. I hope that that was helpful in at least one way. Maybe there's one entry point that you found fascinating or would like to check out more on. And once again, my name is Tyler Finley. And there's my email, tcf234@nyu.edu. If you have any questions about the presentation or you simply want to connect or chat about any of this exciting material. So thank you again.